Lord Jesus Christ.
Good morning. Today's the feast day of the Exaltation of the Cross, which is a feast day that always falls on September 14th. It doesn't matter what day of the week it is. So it means it's not a feast that we always have on Sunday, but this year it does fall on Sunday. 11 years ago, Father Marks had the first masses at the high school on this feast day. And so a joyous anniversary for us from the first Mass being celebrated for the mission. It's just, I think it's a very opportune feast for us. It's a very appropriate feast for us, and really providential that it comes to us on this day. A couple days ago, I was looking at some online ad for like a Christian apparel company, and they had this baseball cap, and it had 3 nails on it to symbolize the nails used for Christ. And maybe as Catholics, we look at that and we're like, yeah, okay, that's, okay. But it kind of struck me because it was an evangelical company, and usually they just prefer the cross. They don't want to, they say Catholics, you put Jesus back on the cross, and but it kind of struck me as a visceral thing to see nails, right? Just like when St. Thomas encountered our risen Lord, he said, I gotta actually see the holes where the nails were. And throughout history, preachers have kind of tried to compare what it's like to see a crucifix. We make crucifixes beautiful, right? We gild them with gold, we add flourish to them, but a cross was this device that the Romans came up with that was really barbaric. It was intended to torture people and to kill them. It was intended to instill fear in people when they saw one. When you would see a cross standing up, you would know a criminal has been executed. He's been tortured and executed. And so you didn't want to see a cross. So like I said, preachers have tried to compare it to different things, and the modern kind of image is an electric chair. So instead of the 3 nails, imagine if we had like the leather straps that held somebody to an electric chair. Or we see this thing, and it's like this is this heinous, torturous device. And so we look to the cross and we exalt the cross. We look to the cross and we recognize that the cross, though initially was a symbol of fear, is a symbol of hope. That the cross is the key, is the answer to all of our problems. The first reading, the Israelites, after being led out of Egypt, being led out of slavery, are grumbling against God and Moses. Oh gosh, that we could go back to slavery, that we could go back to Egypt, that we could go back to our nice, comfortable lives as slaves where, everything was taken care of for us and we didn't have to think for ourselves. If only we could go back to that. And so as they're grumbling against God, God sends these seraph serpents, and the serpents bite them. And the people get sick and they die. Because they've disobeyed God, because they've grumbled against God. I think we live in a world today in which there are a lot of serpents. And we ask ourselves, why? We ask ourselves, why is there evil? Why is there hate? Why is there violence? Because we've grumbled against God. Because we've tried to reestablish and recreate ourselves as God. Because we've tried so hard to make the world in our own image and likeness. That we've looked to the ways of God and said, well, that was nice for a certain time, but it's a little antiquated now. Reflecting on the feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, I recall the story of St. Helena when she found the true cross. She's Constantine's mom. Shortly after Constantine signed the Edict of Milan, allowing for Christianity, she goes to Jerusalem on pilgrimage, and she meets the Bishop of Jerusalem, and while she's there, she finds many of the kind of great artifacts, if you will, that have been brought back to Rome, and now in some cases are all over the world. So she finds the true cross, and there's fragments of the true cross that are all over the place. And people might say, how could we possibly know that that's the cross? Right? How could we possibly believe that, churches all over the world have little splinters of the cross on which Christ was crucified? Well, the Romans were, really good at crucifixion. That was their thing. I forget which one of the Caesars went into France while it was still Gaul, I think, and was trying to find something that they'd stolen, that the barbarians stole, and he went in and crucified like thousands of men, just like it was no big deal. They were really good at it. So they had this kind of graveyard of crosses, and so they dug it up, and they decided they wanted to build a church there, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is still there today. And they found all these crosses, and they said, well, we wonder which cross is the one on which Christ was crucified. And so they found this paralytic, and they laid the paralytic on crosses until he got up and walked. It's a cool story. Our modern ears hear that, though, and we're like, that's a cute little fairy tale, though, isn't it? Right? Yeah, oh, sure, yeah, it's the real cross, okay. We're smarter than that now. You know, we don't believe silly things like that now. We don't believe things that can't be true. I believe it. Jesus actually healed paralyzed people, so what's to say that his cross can't? Our religion is an incarnational religion where Christ comes to meet us where we are, whereas we heard he humbles himself, he takes on our flesh. And so those real tangible things are important. And so while modern man might laugh at us and say, how could you possibly believe that? Or why does it even matter? There's a lot of things that modern man believes today that I think are crazier. And so we look to the cross. We look to the exaltation of the cross. I said we're in a world that has a great number of serpents in it, has a great number of seraph snakes, a great number of threats to reality, threats to life, threats to liberty. And we ask ourselves why. Maybe we remember 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, and we say, gosh, it was so much simpler then, right? It was so much simpler when I'd come home from school and I'd make sure that my mom didn't have any phone calls coming in, and I'd go to our computer, log into Windows 98 and wait, like 10 minutes for it to load up, and then get on the dial-up internet and, talk to my friends on AOL Instant Messenger. So much simpler back then. Now we've got kids that are, bullying each other on their phones and stuff, and we've just got all sorts of nastiness and vitriol. The amount of vitriol that I've read over the last 3 days, and really seen the hatred that exists in the human condition, has really caused me to ask a lot of questions, and it should you too. But then we ask ourselves, well, what's the solution? What's the solution to hatred? What's the solution to evil? What's the solution to violence? We say prayer, but we look at the examples of the last month, right? Children being shot in a church, an innocent woman being stabbed to death, a husband and father being executed in front of a bunch of people, and then videos of it being shown to children. And we say, how do we fix it? How do we restore sanity to our world? How do we restore sanity to our lives? The cross. The cross is the answer. And I know that doesn't make sense. St. Paul says it's a stumbling block to the Jews, and it's absurdity to Gentiles. Because again, we look to a cross and we know that a cross is a symbol of execution. We know that a cross is a symbol of death. But that's the beautiful thing that Christ does, is he takes this symbol of death, he takes death itself, and he makes it the key to life. Death is sad. We mourn death, especially when it's tragedy, especially when it's unjust, especially when life is taken for no reason. But we recognize that death is the key to life. And so if we want to defeat the serpents, we have to name what the serpent is. The serpent is the devil, right? We ask ourselves, what's wrong with the world? The devil is what's wrong with the world. I'm not saying people are the devil. I'm saying the devil himself, the influence that he has over us. All those times throughout the week when we're not at church and we hear that little voice in our head that says, do this, and say, I know I shouldn't, but I don't really care. I'm going to do it anyway. So the solution is to look to the cross. Just as God instructed Moses, make a serpent, put it on a bronze pole, and people will look at it and it'll heal them. The very thing that brings about death brings about life. And so what are we called to do as Christians? We're called to proclaim the gospel. We're called to proclaim Christ. We're called to make Christ present in the world. We're called to love Christ with the same, actually, no more, more passion and zeal than we have for whatever other thing in our life we have all the passion and zeal for. I remind myself of that regularly. I say, if I could love Christ as much as I desire to fill my mind with knowledge of airplanes, I would really love Christ. If I could proclaim Christ with the same way that I want to tell you about how airplanes work, then I'd be proclaiming him a lot better. For you, perhaps it's your work, or it's sports, or it's kind of the next achievement in life. If we could love Christ with the same passion that we love our own kind of personal passions, our own hobbies, if we could love Christ with that same passion, we'd drive all the serpents out. We'd tell the devil, go back to hell. Go back to where you came from. Christ has already conquered you. You have no power over me. You have no power over death. Christ has conquered. A feast like the one today is a strong reminder to us as Christians that we are a contradiction in the world. That we're a contradiction, that we look to Christ, we look to his cross, and we say, I will follow that. I will follow you. I will trust in you. The example that St. Paul gives us in the second reading, he says, Christ humbled himself. He took on the form of man. He was obedient to death, death on a cross. He became like a slave, the lowest of the low. 0 rights, not even considered to be human. Property. He became the lowest of the low. He became a slave for us to bring us eternal life. And he says the way to eternal life is by taking up your cross and following me. Now we think about what our crosses are in life, and we think about having to pick up something heavy, having to do something that we don't like to do, having to make sacrifice. And we do all sorts of things to try to avoid sacrifice. We do all sorts of things to try to avoid having to do hard things. We set it so that our, lights are on timers or on sensors or whatever, and, so you don't have to flip a light switch. We make it so that we don't have to remember things. We make a whole kind of, it's like there's a whole, what am I trying to say? There's a passion, I guess, just to avoid suffering. But Christ calls us to embrace it. Christ calls us to see the areas of suffering in our lives, the areas in which we are called to take up our cross. Are we willing to do that? And then taking up our cross, are we willing to make Christ more present in the world? Are we willing to carry our cross into the world and to show that example? And to say, I'm following Christ, and I'm calling others to do so as well. For you, that's, I think, a challenge. When you go out into the world this week, how many people will you proclaim Christ to? Will you do it to any? Even one? Why not? Are you scared? Are you uncertain? Does it make you uncomfortable? we are called to proclaim Christ always. We are called to proclaim Christ and his truth. And so on this feast of the exaltation of the cross, let us be given that grace that we may take up our crosses daily, that we may shoulder that burden, that we may walk with Christ, that we may know that he has gone before us and he has shown us the way to heaven.